In 2022, a park ranger from the remote wilderness of Olympic National Forest vanished without explanation during what should have been a routine patrol, leaving behind only his empty vehicle and a community desperate for answers. But 2 years later, hikers exploring an overgrown trail discovered something buried beneath fallen autumn leaves, an object so unexpected it would unravel a conspiracy that reached far beyond the forest's edge. Rebecca Crawford sat at her kitchen table on a gray October morning, the steam from her coffee cup rising like ghostly fingers in the pale light filtering through rain-streaked windows. The house felt too quiet, too empty, even after 2 years of living alone. She reached for the newspaper folded beside her mug, a ritual she'd maintained despite knowing it would bring no comfort. The local section always carried the same haunting reminder. Still missing, Park Ranger Ethan Crawford. Below the headline was the photograph she knew by heart, her husband's warm brown eyes, his easy smile beneath the brim of his ranger hat, the Olympic National Forest patch visible on his green uniform. Shirt Ethan had been 34 when he disappeared, a man who knew those mountains better than anyone, who could navigate through dense fog and treacherous terrain with the confidence of someone born to the wilderness. He had been a ranger for 8 years, respected by colleagues and beloved by the hiking community for his patient guidance and genuine care for both the forest and its visitors. The morning of October 15, 2022, had started like any other. Ethan kissed her goodbye at 6:30 a.m., his thermos filled with black coffee, his radio crackling with routine check-ins from other rangers. He was scheduled to patrol the northern section of Hurricane Ridge, an area he'd covered hundreds of times before. The weather was clear, visibility excellent. By evening, when he failed to return home, Rebecca knew something was terribly wrong. Ethan never missed dinner without calling. He never broke his promises, and he had promised to help her hang new curtains in the bedroom that weekend. The search had consumed 3 weeks. Helicopters circled overhead while rescue teams combed every trail, every ravine, every hidden creek bed. They found his ranger vehicle parked at the obstruction point trailhead, keys still in the ignition, his lunch untouched on the passenger seat. His radio lay on the dashboard, turned off, but Ethan himself had simply vanished. The official investigation concluded with frustrating ambiguity. No signs of foul play, no evidence of an accident, no indication of where he might have gone or why. The case grew cold as winter settled over the mountains, and Rebecca was left with questions that gnawed at her soul like persistent hunger. She folded the newspaper and pushed it away, unable to bear reading the same hollow updates about leads that went nowhere and searches that found nothing. Outside, the October rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows, the sound that had become the soundtrack to her solitude. Rebecca's phone buzzed against the wooden table. She glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number, with a local area code. Her heart skipped. Unknown calls still carried the possibility of news, however unlikely. "Hello?" she answered, her voice cautious but hopeful. "Mrs. Crawford? This is Detective Sullivan from the Olympic County Sheriff's Department. I apologize for calling so early, but we've received some information regarding your husband's case that requires immediate attention." Rebecca's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of information?" "2 hikers found something yesterday afternoon in the forest that might be connected to Ethan's disappearance. We'd like you to come in and take a look if you're willing." "Found something?" Rebecca's voice barely rose above a whisper. "What did they find?" "I'd prefer to discuss the details in person, Mrs. Crawford. Can you come to the station this morning? I know this is difficult, but your identification could be crucial." Rebecca stared out the rain-soaked window toward the dark outline of the mountains where her husband had vanished. After 2 years of silence, the forest was finally ready to give up its secrets. "I'll be there in an hour," she said, already reaching for her keys. As she drove through the misty morning toward town, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that whatever the hikers had discovered would change everything. The trees that lined the road seemed to lean closer, their branches heavy with rain and secrets, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. She had no idea that the small object buried beneath those autumn leaves would expose a truth more shocking than anything she had imagined. or that her quiet life as a widow was about to become the center of a mystery that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the man she had loved and lost. The Olympic County Sheriff's Department occupied a modest brick building on the edge of town, its windows fogged with condensation from the persistent October rain. Rebecca parked between two patrol cars and sat for a moment, gathering courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Through the glass doors, she could see the familiar bustle of a small-town police station, officers moving with purpose, phones ringing, the controlled chaos of people trying to solve problems that often had no clean solutions. Detective Sullivan met her at the front desk. He was a man in his early 50s with graying temples and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent dealing with other people's worst days. His handshake was firm but gentle, and his eyes held the sort of compassion that couldn't be taught. "Mrs. Crawford, thank you for coming so quickly," he said, guiding her past the reception area toward a corridor lined with interview rooms. "I know the past 2 years have been incredibly difficult. Please just call me Rebecca," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "What exactly did these hikers find?" Detective Sullivan paused outside a door marked Interview Room B. "Before we go in, I want you to understand that we don't yet know if this item is connected to Ethan's disappearance, but there are certain aspects that make it significant enough to warrant your examination." He opened the door to reveal a small, windowless room containing only a metal table, several chairs, and a young couple who appeared to be in their late 20s. The woman had shoulder-length blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, while the man wore a fleece jacket and hiking boots that were still damp from their morning in the forest. "Rebecca, these are Jake Morrison and Emma Chen, the hikers who made the discovery," Detective Sullivan said. "Jake, Emma, this is Rebecca Crawford, Ethan's wife." Jake stood immediately, extending his hand. "Mrs. Crawford, I'm so sorry about your husband. We've been following his case in the news." Emma nodded sympathetically. "We hope what we found might help somehow." Detective Sullivan gestured for everyone to sit. On the table before them was a clear evidence bag containing what appeared to be a small rectangular device. Rebecca leaned forward, squinting at the object through the plastic. "It's a GPS unit," Jake explained, his voice careful and measured, "but not a regular hiking GPS. This one looks more professional, like something a Park Service employee might use." Rebecca's breath caught. She recognized it immediately, the black casing, the rubberized edges designed to withstand harsh conditions, the small crack near the power button that Ethan had made when he dropped it during a rescue operation the previous spring. "That's Ethan's," she whispered, her hand moving instinctively toward the bag before stopping short. "He carried it on every patrol. Where did you find it?" Emma and Jake exchanged glances before Emma began their story. "We were hiking the Deer Park Trail yesterday afternoon, about 3 miles from the main road. It's not a popular trail. Pretty overgrown and difficult to follow in some sections. We'd stopped for lunch near this old cedar tree," Jake continued. "Emma was sitting on what we thought was just a fallen log, but when she shifted her weight, the whole thing kind of crumbled. It was completely rotted through." "That's when I saw something underneath," Emma said. "At first I thought it was just a rock, but when I brushed away the leaves and moss, I realized it was this GPS unit. It was partially buried, like it had been there for a while." Detective Sullivan pulled out a topographical map and spread it across the table. "Can you show us exactly where you found it?" Jake studied the map for a moment before pointing to an area marked with dense contour lines. "Here, I think. About halfway up this ridge, maybe 200 yards off the main trail." Rebecca stared at the location Jake had indicated. It was nowhere, near Hurricane Ridge, where Ethan's vehicle had been found. In fact, it was in the opposite direction entirely, in a section of forest that most visitors never saw, a wild, difficult terrain that even experienced hikers avoided. "That doesn't make sense," Rebecca murmured. "Ethan was supposed to be patrolling Hurricane Ridge that day. This is miles away from his assigned area." Detective Sullivan nodded grimly. "That's what makes this discovery particularly troubling. If this GPS unit is indeed your husband's, it suggests he was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be on the day he disappeared. Or someone else was carrying it," Emma added quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications that, Rebecca wasn't ready to consider. She had spent 2 years believing that Ethan had simply gotten lost or fallen, or encountered some accident in the wilderness he loved. The possibility that his disappearance might have been something more deliberate had never seriously entered her mind. "Can you tell when it was last used?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Sullivan carefully removed the GPS unit from the evidence bag, handling it with latex gloves. "The device is severely water damaged and the battery is completely dead. We'll need to send it to the state crime lab to see if they can retrieve any data from the internal memory." He paused, meeting Rebecca's eyes. "But there's something else. Something that makes this discovery even more significant." Rebecca felt her stomach clench. "What?" "The hikers didn't just find the GPS unit," Detective Sullivan said slowly. "They found it wrapped in something." He reached for a second evidence bag. A piece of fabric that appears to be torn from a park ranger uniform. Rebecca stared at the fabric through the clear plastic, the distinctive green material she had washed and ironed dozens of times, now stained with earth and time. A piece of her husband's uniform, hidden beneath a rotting log miles from where anyone thought to look. For the first time since Ethan's disappearance, Rebecca Crawford began to suspect that her husband hadn't simply gotten lost in the wilderness. Someone had wanted him to disappear. The silence in the interview room stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the distant sound of rain against the building's windows. Rebecca stared at the torn fabric, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The green material looked so small and insignificant in the evidence bag, yet it represented the first tangible clue to her husband's fate in over 2 years. Detective Sullivan cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Crawford, I know this is overwhelming. Would you like some water or would you prefer to take a break?" Rebecca shook her head, her gaze never leaving the evidence. "No. I need to understand what happened. Can you tell how long these items have been buried?" "The forensics team is still analyzing everything," the detective replied. "But based on the condition of the GPS unit and the fabric, they estimate the items have been in the ground for approximately 18 to 24 months. Since shortly after Ethan disappeared," Rebecca whispered. Emma leaned forward, her expression troubled. "There's something else about where we found these things, the location. It's not exactly easy to reach. We're both experienced hikers, and even we had trouble getting there. The trail is barely visible and you have to climb over several fallen trees to reach that spot." Jake nodded in agreement. "It's like someone specifically chose a place where things wouldn't be found accidentally. You'd have to know that area really well to even consider hiding something there." Detective Sullivan pulled out a yellow legal pad and began taking notes. "That's a good point. Mrs. Crawford, did your husband ever mention that particular section of the forest? The deer park area?" Rebecca closed her eyes, trying to remember conversations from 2 years ago. Ethan had always been eager to share stories about his workday, unusual wildlife sightings, interesting visitors he'd helped, challenging rescues he'd participated in. But as she searched her memory, she couldn't recall him ever mentioning the remote trail where his belongings had been found. "I don't think so," she said finally. But Ethan knew every inch of that forest. He'd been working there for 8 years. If someone needed to hide something, he would have known all the best places. The implication of her own words hit her like a physical blow. She was suggesting that her husband might have hidden his own GPS unit and uniform, which made no sense unless— "Mrs. Crawford," Detective Sullivan said carefully, "I have to ask some difficult questions. Was Ethan experiencing any problems at work? Any conflicts with supervisors or fellow rangers? Any financial difficulties at home?" "No," Rebecca replied firmly. "Ethan loved his job. He got along well with everyone at the ranger station, and we didn't have money problems. We lived simply, but we were comfortable." "What about his mental state?" the detective continued. "Had he been depressed or anxious? Any changes in behavior in the weeks before he disappeared?" Rebecca felt a flush of anger. "Ethan didn't kill himself, if that's what you're suggesting, and he didn't run away. He wouldn't have done that to me, to his family, to the people who depended on him." Detective Sullivan held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not suggesting anything, Mrs. Crawford. I'm just trying to understand all the possibilities. These questions are standard procedure. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Detective, there was something else about the location that seemed odd. The area around where we found the GPS. It looked like the ground had been disturbed at some point, like someone had dug there. Disturbed how? Detective Sullivan asked, his pen poised over his notepad. The soil was different, Jake explained. Darker, more compact than the surrounding earth. And there were these strange mounds nearby, like someone had been moving dirt around. Rebecca felt her heart racing. You think someone buried other things? There? It's possible, Detective Sullivan said. We're planning to bring in ground-penetrating radar equipment tomorrow to scan the area. If there are other buried objects, we'll find them. The detective's phone buzzed and he glanced at the screen before standing. I need to take this call. It's the crime lab. He stepped into the hallway, leaving Rebecca alone with Jake and Emma. Mrs. Crawford, Emma said softly, I hope you know how sorry we are about all of this. When we realized what we'd found, we knew it would be painful for you. You did the right thing, Rebecca replied. I've been waiting 2 years for any kind of answer, even if it's not the answer I wanted. Jake leaned back in his chair. Can I ask you something? The day your husband disappeared, do you remember anything unusual about his routine? Anything different from normal? Rebecca thought carefully. He seemed a little distracted at breakfast. I remember asking him about it, and he said he had a lot on his mind with work, but he didn't elaborate. Did he ever bring work problems home? Emma asked. Not usually. Ethan was good at separating his job from his personal life, but that morning, Rebecca paused, a memory surfacing. He got a phone call while he was getting dressed. It was early, maybe 6 o'clock. I was still half asleep, but I remember thinking it was unusual for someone to call so early unless it was an emergency. Did you hear what the call was about? No, he took it in the other room. When he came back, he said it was just work stuff. But now that I think about it, he seemed different after that call, more serious. Detective Sullivan returned to the room, his expression grim. That was the lab. They've managed to extract some data from the GPS unit. Rebecca straightened in her chair. What did they find? The last recorded location was logged at 3:47 p.m. on October 15, 2022, the day your husband disappeared. But here's what's interesting. The coordinates don't match either Hurricane Ridge, where his vehicle was found, or the Deer Park area, where the GPS was buried. Where was he? Rebecca asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Detective Sullivan consulted his notes. According to the GPS data, Ethan's last known location was at a private cabin about 12 miles southeast of the park boundaries, a property that belongs to someone with connections to the Olympic National Forest. The room fell silent again as everyone absorbed this information. Rebecca felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew about her husband's disappearance was proving to be wrong. Who owns the cabin? She whispered. Detective Sullivan met her eyes, his expression troubled. Someone your husband worked with. Someone who would have had every reason to know his patrol schedule and his plans for that day. Rebecca's blood ran cold as she realized that Ethan's disappearance wasn't a random tragedy or an accident in the wilderness. It was something far more sinister, a betrayal by someone he trusted, someone who had used that trust to lead him into danger. The forest wasn't the only thing that had been keeping secrets. Rebecca's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the metal table. Who? She asked, her voice barely audible. Who owns the cabin? Detective Sullivan hesitated, clearly weighing his words. Mrs. Crawford, I want to stress that ownership of a property doesn't imply guilt of any wrongdoing. We're dealing with preliminary information here. Please, Rebecca said, her voice stronger now. I need to know. The detective glanced at his notes one more time before meeting her eyes. The property is registered to Thomas Brennan. He's the assistant superintendent for Olympic National Forest. The name hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Tom Brennan had been at Ethan's funeral, had spoken eloquently about his dedication to the forest and his colleagues. He was the man who had promised her that they would never stop looking for answers about what happened to her husband. "That's impossible," Rebecca whispered. "Tom and Ethan were friends. They worked together for years. Tom was one of the people leading the search parties." Jake and Emma exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly sensing they were witnessing something deeply personal and painful. Emma spoke quietly. "Mrs. Crawford, is there somewhere private we could call you later? We don't want to intrude on what seems like a family matter." Detective Sullivan nodded. "That might be best. We have your contact information, and we'll definitely need formal statements from both of you. Thank you for bringing this to our attention." After Jake and Emma left, Detective Sullivan closed the door and returned to his seat. "I know this is shocking, Mrs. Crawford, but we need to consider all possibilities before jumping to conclusions." "What kind of possibilities?" Rebecca asked, though her mind was already racing through memories of every interaction she'd had with Tom Brennan over the past 2 years. It could be completely innocent. Maybe Ethan went to meet Brennan about work-related business. Maybe there was some kind of emergency or situation that required them to meet off-site. The fact that Ethan's GPS shows he was near Brennan's cabin doesn't necessarily mean Brennan was involved in his disappearance. But even as Detective Sullivan spoke the words, Rebecca could see the doubt in his eyes. Too many pieces of this puzzle weren't fitting together in any innocent way. "I want to see the cabin," Rebecca said suddenly. "Mrs. Crawford, I don't think that's a good idea. If this is an active crime scene, then investigate it properly," Rebecca interrupted. "But I'm not going to sit at home wondering what happened to my husband when there are finally leads to follow. I've been waiting 2 years for this." Detective Sullivan studied her face for a long moment. "Let me make some calls first. We'll need to approach this carefully. If Brennan is involved in something criminal, we can't afford to tip him off before we have more evidence. Is he still working at the Forest Service?" "As far as I know, yes. He's still the assistant superintendent, which means he's had access to all the information about the search for your husband, all the investigation files, all the evidence that was collected." The implication was clear. If Tom Brennan was involved in Ethan's disappearance, he would have been perfectly positioned to misdirect the investigation, to ensure that searchers looked everywhere except where they should have been looking. Rebecca thought back to all the progress reports Brennan had given her over the months following Ethan's disappearance. His apparent frustration when searches turned up nothing. His promises to expand the search area, to bring in additional resources. Had it all been an elaborate deception? "There's something I need to tell you," Rebecca said slowly. "About Tom Brennan." Detective Sullivan leaned forward, his attention focused entirely on her. 3 months after Ethan disappeared, Tom started calling me. Not about the investigation. Personal calls. He said he was checking on how I was doing, offering to help with things around the house that Ethan used to take care of. That doesn't sound unusual. Colleagues often try to support the families of missing or deceased co-workers. "At first, I thought so too," Rebecca continued. "But the calls became more frequent, more personal. He started asking me out to dinner, suggesting we could comfort each other through our grief. He said he understood what I was going through because he'd also lost someone important to him." Detective Sullivan's expression darkened. "How did you respond?" "I told him I wasn't ready for any kind of relationship, that I was still hoping Ethan would come home. But Tom was persistent. He kept saying that I needed to accept reality, that I needed to move on with my life." "When was the last time he contacted you?" Rebecca thought carefully. "About 6 months ago. I finally had to be very direct with him. I told him his calls were inappropriate and asked him to stop. He seemed angry when I rejected him. He said something that bothered me at the time." "What did he say?" "He said that Ethan was never coming back and that I was fooling myself if I thought otherwise. But it wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Like he was stating a fact he knew for certain, not just expressing an opinion." Detective Sullivan was taking detailed notes now. "Mrs. Crawford, did you ever mention these conversations to anyone else? Family members, friends, other law enforcement?" Rebecca shook her head. "I was embarrassed, and I didn't want to cause problems for Tom at work if I was misinterpreting his intentions. Plus, at the time, I thought he was just being awkward about expressing sympathy." But now? Now I'm wondering if Tom Brennan's interest in me started before Ethan disappeared, Rebecca said quietly, and I'm wondering if my husband somehow found out about it. The two sat in silence for several minutes, both contemplating the dark possibilities that Rebecca's revelations had opened up. Outside, the October rain continued its relentless drumming, as if the sky itself was mourning for secrets finally brought to light. Detective Sullivan eventually spoke. We're going to need to move very carefully here. If Brennan suspects we're investigating him, he could destroy evidence or disappear himself. But based on what you've told me, combined with the GPS data, I think we have enough to justify getting a search warrant for his cabin. How long will that take? A day or two if we're lucky. In the meantime, I need you to promise me you won't contact Brennan or do anything that might alert him to our suspicions. Rebecca nodded, though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to confront the man who might have destroyed her life. What about the ground-penetrating radar? Are you still planning to search the area where the GPS was found? Yes, that's happening tomorrow morning. If there are other items buried there, or worse, we'll find them. As Rebecca prepared to leave the police station, Detective Sullivan handed her his business card. Call me if you remember anything else about Brennan's behavior, no matter how small it might seem. Sometimes the smallest details are the ones that break a case open. Walking to her car through the persistent rain, Rebecca felt as though she was seeing the world with new eyes. For 2 years, she had been a widow grieving her husband's tragic disappearance. Now, she was beginning to understand that she might be something else entirely, the wife of a murder victim and the unwitting target of her husband's killer. The thought terrified her, but it also filled her with a cold determination she hadn't felt since the day Ethan vanished. If Tom Brennan had taken her husband from her, she was going to make sure he paid for what he'd done. But first, she needed to know exactly what had happened in that remote cabin 18 months ago, when a trusted colleague had lured Ethan Crawford into the wilderness for the last time. Rebecca drove home through the gray afternoon, her windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the Pacific Northwest rain. Every mile of familiar road now felt different, tainted by the possibility that someone she had trusted was responsible for destroying her world. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the weight of Detective Sullivan's revelations had settled into her bones like a deep chill. Inside her empty house, Rebecca stood in the kitchen where she had shared breakfast with Ethan on his final morning. The memory felt different now, charged with new significance. She replayed their conversation, in her mind searching for details she might have overlooked. That early morning phone call, Ethan's distracted behavior, his unusual seriousness after taking the call in the other room. Rebecca walked to their bedroom and opened the closet where Ethan's clothes still hung exactly as he had left them. She pressed her face against one of his flannel shirts, inhaling the faint scent of cedar and pine that always clung to his Forest Service uniforms. For 2 years, she had found comfort in preserving everything exactly as it was. Now she wondered if her refusal to let go had been keeping her from seeing the truth. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Detective Sullivan's name appeared on the screen. Mrs. Crawford, I wanted to update you on our progress. We've been granted an expedited search warrant for Brennan's cabin. We'll be executing it tomorrow morning. Can I be there? I'm afraid not, but I promise to keep you informed of anything we discover. There's something else. We've moved up the ground-penetrating radar search to this evening. The weather forecast calls for heavy rain through the weekend, and we don't want to risk losing the opportunity. Rebecca glanced out her window at the darkening sky. What exactly are you hoping to find? Honestly, we're not sure. But based on the hiker's description of disturbed soil, we need to determine if other evidence was buried in that location. After ending the call, Rebecca found herself unable to sit still. The house felt suffocating, filled with too many memories and too many questions. She grabbed her rain jacket and headed for her car, knowing she needed to be somewhere that made her feel connected to Ethan. 20 minutes later, she stood at the edge of Hurricane Ridge, the area where her husband's abandoned vehicle had been found. The parking lot was empty except for a single maintenance truck, its yellow warning lights flashing in the growing dusk. The mountains beyond were shrouded in clouds, their peaks invisible in the gray mist. Rebecca walked to the spot where Ethan's Ranger vehicle had been discovered, keys in the ignition, lunch untouched. For 2 years she had wondered why he had stopped here, what had drawn him away from his truck and into the wilderness beyond. Now she understood that he had probably never intended to come to Hurricane Ridge at all. The truck had been positioned here deliberately, to create a false trail for searchers to follow, while the real answers lay 12 miles away at Tom Brennan's cabin. "I should have known," she whispered to the wind. "I should have seen the signs." But what signs could she have seen? Tom Brennan had been a colleague, a friend, someone who shared Ethan's passion for protecting the forest. He had been one of the first people to offer condolences, one of the most dedicated searchers during those awful weeks. Rebecca pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Tom's number. For a moment, she considered calling him, confronting him directly. But Detective Sullivan's warnings echoed in her mind. If Tom suspected they were investigating him, he might destroy evidence or disappear. Instead, she found herself scrolling through her text message history, looking for any communication she might have had with Tom over the past 2 years. Most of the messages were brief and professional, updates about the search, information about memorial services for Ethan. But as she scrolled further back, she found something that made her stomach clench. A text from Tom sent 3 weeks after Ethan's disappearance. "Rebecca, I know this is difficult, but you should start thinking about Ethan's life insurance. The sooner you file the claim, the sooner you can start rebuilding your life." At the time, she had thought Tom was being practical, even caring. Insurance claims required death certificates, and death certificates couldn't be issued for missing persons until they had been declared legally dead, a process that typically took 7 years. But Tom had been pushing her to begin that process, just 3 weeks after Ethan's disappearance, when hope for his return should still have been strong. Rebecca scrolled through more messages, finding other suggestions from Tom about moving forward and accepting reality. Messages that seemed supportive at the time now read like psychological manipulation, attempts to convince her that Ethan was dead long before anyone should have given up hope. Her phone buzzed with a new text from Detective Sullivan. "Ground. Radar search complete. We found something. Need you to come to the site immediately." Rebecca's hands shook as she read the message. She quickly texted back, "On my way." The drive to the Deer Park area took 40 minutes through increasingly treacherous mountain roads. Rain had intensified, and her headlights barely penetrated the thick darkness that had settled over the forest. When she finally reached the trailhead, she could see the glow of portable floodlights deeper in the woods. Detective Sullivan met her at the edge of the trail, his rain jacket dripping and his expression grim. "Mrs. Crawford, before we go any further, I need to prepare you for what we've found." "Just tell me," Rebecca said, pulling her hood tighter against the driving rain. The ground-penetrating radar detected a large object, buried approximately 6 feet underground. About 30 yards from where the hikers found your husband's GPS unit. Based on the size and shape of the radar signature, we believe it's human remains. Rebecca felt the world tilt around her. After 2 years of hoping, of imagining that Ethan might somehow still be alive, the possibility she had never wanted to acknowledge was finally staring her in the face. "Are you sure?" "We won't know for certain until we excavate, but the evidence is compelling. Mrs. Crawford, there's something else." The radar also detected what appears to be additional objects buried with the remains. Personal effects, possibly, including jewelry or other identifying items. Detective Sullivan paused, studying her face in the harsh glow of the floodlights. "We're going to begin excavation first thing tomorrow morning. It's a delicate process, and we want to preserve any evidence we might find. Are you prepared for the possibility that we're about to recover your husband's body?" Rebecca looked through the trees toward the lights where forensic technicians were working, documenting the scene that might finally provide answers to the question that had haunted her for 2 years. In a few hours, she might know for certain whether Ethan was dead, and if the remains were his, she would also know that someone had murdered him and buried him in the forest he had loved. "I've been preparing for this possibility since the day he disappeared," she said quietly. "But I need to know the truth. whatever it is. As they walked through the rain toward the excavation site, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was finally ready to give up its secrets. The trees seemed to lean closer in the darkness, as if they too had been waiting for this moment of revelation. Tomorrow, the earth would yield its evidence. Tomorrow she would learn whether her 2-year journey as a wife waiting for her husband's return was about to become a widow seeking justice for his murder. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Olympic Mountains, the October sky heavy with clouds that promised more rain. Rebecca had barely slept, spending the night in a restless cycle of dozing and waking, her mind replaying every conversation she'd ever had with Tom Brennan. Now, sitting in her kitchen with untouched coffee growing cold, she waited for Detective V.O. Sullivan's call about the excavation. Her phone rang at exactly 7:30 a.m. "Mrs. Crawford, we're beginning the excavation now. The process will take several hours. And I want to stress that you don't need to be here for this part. It's going to be difficult to watch." "I understand," Rebecca replied. "But I need to be there when you know for certain. Will you call me?" "Of course." "Mrs. Crawford, there's something else. We executed the search warrant at Brennan's cabin an hour ago." Rebecca's grip tightened on the phone. "What did you find?" "Brennan wasn't there. According to his neighbors, he left yesterday evening with several suitcases and camping equipment. Said he was taking a long weekend trip to visit family in Oregon." The timing sent a chill down Rebecca's spine. "He ran." "It appears that way. We've issued a BOLO alert for his vehicle and we're coordinating with Oregon State Police. But Mrs. Crawford, even though Brennan is gone, the cabin search was productive." Detective Sullivan paused and Rebecca could hear papers rustling in the background. "We found your husband's Ranger jacket hanging in Brennan's bedroom closet, along with his service radio and his personal hiking boots. There's no innocent explanation for why Brennan would have Ethan's equipment." Rebecca felt sick. "What else?" "A journal. Brennan apparently kept detailed records of his interactions with you over the past 2 years. Every phone call, every conversation, every time he saw you in town. Mrs. Crawford, this man has been obsessed with you since long before your husband disappeared." The words hit Rebecca like physical blows. While she had been grieving her husband, Tom Brennan had been watching her, documenting her life, collecting trophies from the man he had killed. "There's more," Detective Sullivan continued. "We found correspondence between Brennan and someone at the State Insurance Commission. It appears he was researching the process for declaring missing persons legally dead, specifically how to expedite life insurance claims. He was planning to help me file for Ethan's death benefits," Rebecca whispered. "It looks that way. And based on the dates of these documents, he was researching this information before your husband disappeared." Rebecca sank into a kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Tom's premeditation. This hadn't been a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. Tom Brennan had planned her husband's murder with cold calculation, viewing Ethan's death as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. "Detective Sullivan, I need to ask you something," Rebecca said. "The morning Ethan disappeared, that early phone call he received, could it have been from Tom? We're pulling phone records now. But based on everything we found, I think it's very likely that Brennan called your husband with some kind of urgent request to meet him at the cabin." Rebecca closed her eyes, imagining Ethan getting dressed that morning, believing he was responding to a legitimate work emergency. He had trusted Tom completely. The betrayal would have been unthinkable to him. "Mrs. Crawford, I need to ask, do you have somewhere safe to stay for the next few days? Family or friends who live outside the area?" "Why?" But even as she asked the question, Rebecca understood. If Tom Brennan was desperate enough to run, he might be desperate enough to eliminate the one person who could connect him to Ethan's murder. "It's just a precaution," Detective Sullivan said. "But until we have Brennan in custody, I'd feel more comfortable knowing you weren't alone." Rebecca thought of her sister in Seattle, who had been begging her to visit for months. "I can stay with my sister for a few days." "Good. Pack a bag and head there today. I'll call you as soon as we have news from the excavation." After ending the call, Rebecca moved through her house mechanically, gathering clothes and essentials. In her bedroom, she paused at the photograph on her nightstand, their wedding picture taken 8 years ago in a small church overlooking Puget Sound. Ethan's smile was radiant, his arm protectively around her waist. She had no way of knowing then that loving him would make her the target of a killer's obsession. As she packed, Rebecca found herself thinking about the journal Detective Sullivan had mentioned. Tom Brennan had been watching her, documenting her grief, her struggles, her attempts to rebuild her life. Every moment of vulnerability had been recorded by the man who had created that vulnerability. The phone rang again. This time it was her sister Jenny calling from Seattle. "Rebecca? I just heard on the news that there's been a development in Ethan's case. Are you okay?" "Jenny, I need to come stay with you for a few days. I'll explain everything when I get there." "Of course. Drive carefully. The weather's supposed to get worse." Rebecca finished packing and loaded her car. As she prepared to leave, she took one last look at the house she had shared with Ethan. For 2 years, it had been a shrine to their interrupted life together. Now it felt like something else, evidence of how completely Tom Brennan had destroyed everything she held dear. The drive to Seattle took 3 hours through increasingly severe weather. Rebecca's phone remained silent, which she took as a sign that the excavation was still ongoing. By the time she reached Jenny's apartment in Capitol Hill, the rain had intensified to a torrential downpour that made driving treacherous. Jenny met her at the door with a hug that lasted longer than usual. "Rebecca, what's happening? The news is saying they found evidence related to Ethan's disappearance." Rebecca collapsed onto Jenny's couch and told her everything. The GPS unit, Tom Brennan's cabin, the journal documenting his obsession, his sudden flight from town. Jenny listened in horrified silence, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. "I can't believe Tom Brennan," Jenny said when Rebecca finished. "I met him at the funeral. He seemed so sincere, so devastated about Ethan." "That's what made him dangerous," Rebecca replied. "He knew exactly how to present himself as a grieving colleague and a supportive friend." Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text message. "Detective Sullivan. Call me immediately." Rebecca dialed his number with trembling fingers. "Detective?" "Mrs. Crawford, we've completed the excavation. We found human remains along with personal effects including a wedding ring engraved with the initials EC and a date that matches your wedding anniversary." Rebecca felt the world tilt around her. After 2 years of uncertainty, she finally had her answer. Ethan was dead, had been dead since the day he disappeared. "There's something else," Detective Sullivan continued. "The medical examiner's preliminary assessment indicates the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Mrs. Crawford, your husband was murdered." Rebecca gripped the phone tighter, though tears were streaming down her face. "What happens now?" "We continue searching for Brennan. And Mrs. Crawford, we found something else with the remains. A note, apparently written by your husband and hidden in his jacket pocket. I think you need to see it." "What does it say?" "Detective." Sullivan's voice was gentle. "It says, if something happens to me, look closely at Tom Brennan. He's been asking too many questions about Rebecca, and I think he's planning something. I love my wife, and I'm sorry I couldn't protect her." Rebecca began sobbing, overwhelmed by grief and rage in equal measure. Even in his final moments, Ethan had been thinking of her, trying to leave her a message that would lead to justice. "Mrs. Crawford, are you still there?" "Yes," she managed through her tears. "We're going to find him. Brennan won't get away with this." As Rebecca ended the call, she realized that her 2-year journey as a widow was entering a new phase. She was no longer waiting for answers about what had happened to her husband. Now she was waiting for justice against the man who had killed him. But first, she had to accept the reality that Tom Brennan was still out there somewhere, free and dangerous, possibly planning his next move. The man who had destroyed her life once might not be finished with her yet. 3 days passed in Jenny's Seattle apartment while Rebecca waited for news about Tom Brennan's capture. The national media had picked up the story, turning Ethan's murder into headline news across the Pacific Northwest. Rebecca found herself unable to watch the coverage, sickened by the way reporters sensationalized her husband's death and her own unwitting role as the object of a killer's obsession. On Thursday morning, Detective Sullivan called with an update that sent chills down Rebecca's spine. "We found Brennan's vehicle abandoned at a rest stop outside Portland," he said, "but there's no sign of him. Oregon State Police are treating this as a manhunt now." "He could be anywhere," Rebecca said, staring out Jenny's apartment window at the busy Seattle street below. "Mrs. Crawford, there's something else. We've been analyzing Brennan's journal more thoroughly, and we found entries that suggest he may have been planning this for longer than we initially thought." Rebecca felt her stomach clench. "What do you mean?" "There are entries dating back 3 years, long before your husband disappeared. Brennan wrote about watching you and Ethan together, about feeling that Ethan didn't deserve you. He documented your daily routines, places you shopped, restaurants you frequented. The violation felt overwhelming. For years, Tom Brennan had been stalking her while pretending to be a family friend. Every casual conversation at community events, every polite greeting at the grocery store had been part of his twisted fantasy. "Detective Sullivan, I need to ask you something," Rebecca said. "Do you think he's still nearby, still watching me?" "Honestly, I don't know. But we're taking every precaution. We've got surveillance on your house, and we're monitoring your credit cards and phone records for any unusual activity." After ending the call, Rebecca found Jenny in the kitchen making lunch. Her sister took one look at her face and immediately set down the sandwich she was preparing. "What did Detective Sullivan say?" "Tom's been watching me for 3 years," Rebecca said quietly. 3 years, Jenny. While I thought he was just Ethan's colleague, he was stalking both of us." Jenny pulled Rebecca into a hug. "I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how violated you must feel. I keep thinking about all the times he offered to help with things around the house after Ethan disappeared. I almost let him come over several times. If I had, don't do that to yourself," Jenny said firmly. "You couldn't have known what he was really thinking." Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her heart stopped as she read the message. "Rebecca, I know you're in Seattle. We need to talk. I can explain everything. Meet me at Pike Place Market at 3 p.m. Come alone, or I'll disappear forever and you'll never know the whole truth about what happened to Ethan." Rebecca showed the text to Jenny, whose face went pale. "You have to call Detective Sullivan immediately," Jenny said. "He's right, though," Rebecca said, staring at the message. "If Tom disappears now, I might never know exactly what happened to Ethan. There might be things he never wrote in his journal. Rebecca, no, this is obviously a trap." But Rebecca was already thinking through the possibilities. Pike Place Market was crowded, public, full of witnesses. If she called Detective Sullivan first, he could have officers positioned nearby. She wouldn't have to meet Tom alone, just make him think she was alone. "I'm calling the detective," Rebecca said, dialing Sullivan's number. When she explained the situation, Detective Sullivan's response was immediate and emphatic. "Absolutely not. This is exactly the kind of situation where people get killed." "But he's right," Rebecca insisted. "If he disappears, we might never know the full truth. And Pike Place Market is public. You could have officers there. Mrs. Crawford, Brennan has already killed one person you loved. Don't give him the opportunity to kill you too. What if I wore a wire? What if you had snipers positioned nearby? Detective Sullivan, this might be our only chance to capture him." There was a long silence on the line before Sullivan spoke again. "I'll need to clear this with my supervisor and coordinate with Seattle PD. If we do this, and I'm not saying we will, it would be a major operation with significant risks." "I understand the risks," Rebecca said, "but I also understand that Tom Brennan took everything from me. My husband, my sense of safety, my ability to trust people. I want him caught, and I want to look him in the eye when it happens." Detective Sullivan sighed heavily. "Give me 2 hours to put together a plan. Don't respond to his text yet. And Mrs. Crawford, if my supervisor says no, then the answer is no. I won't risk your life on a maybe." After ending the call, Rebecca sat with Jenny in tense silence. Outside, Seattle's afternoon traffic created a constant hum of urban life. Normal people going about their normal days while Rebecca waited to learn if she would come face to face with her husband's killer. "Are you sure about this?" Jenny asked quietly. "No," Rebecca admitted. "But I've been living in fear for 2 years without even knowing it. I'm tired of being afraid." Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Tom. "I'm waiting for your answer. Rebecca, 3 p.m. Don't disappoint me." Rebecca stared at the message, knowing that in a few hours she might finally understand why Tom Brennan had decided that murdering her husband was an acceptable price to pay for his obsession with her. Detective Sullivan called back at 1:30 p.m. with a plan that made Rebecca's stomach churn with nervous anticipation. "Seattle PD has agreed to assist, but there are strict conditions," he said. "You'll wear a concealed recording device and have a GPS tracker. Plainclothes officers will be positioned throughout the market, and there will be snipers on nearby rooftops. At the first sign of trouble, we move in." "What do I say to him?" Rebecca asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Keep him talking. Get him to confess details about Ethan's murder. But Mrs. Crawford, if he tries to get you to leave the market with him, you refuse absolutely. That's when situations like this turn deadly." An hour later, Rebecca stood outside Pike Place Market wearing jeans, a raincoat, and a small recording device taped beneath her shirt. Detective Sullivan and a Seattle police technician had spent 20 minutes ensuring the equipment was properly concealed and functioning. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed her response to Tom's text. "I'll be there at 3 p.m., fish throwing area." The market was crowded with Thursday afternoon tourists and locals, the familiar chaos of vendors calling out their wares and customers navigating the narrow aisles between stalls. Rebecca made her way to the famous fish-throwing counter where workers tossed salmon through the air to entertain onlookers. She positioned herself where she could see the main entrance while keeping her back to a wall. At exactly 3 p.m., she spotted Tom Brennan approaching through the crowd. He looked different, thinner, unshaven, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. But his walk was unmistakable, the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority. When he saw her, Tom's face broke into the same friendly smile she remembered from dozens of casual encounters over the years. The normalcy of his expression was somehow more frightening than if he had looked obviously dangerous. "Rebecca," he said, stepping close enough that she could smell coffee on his breath. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Why did you kill my husband?" Rebecca asked directly, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Tom's smile faltered slightly. "Let's walk. Too many people here." "No. We talk here or we don't talk at all." Tom studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Ethan was never good enough for you. He was weak, content with his small life in a small town. You deserved so much more. That wasn't your decision to make, wasn't it?" Tom's voice carried an edge of the obsession Rebecca had never heard before. "I watched you for years, Rebecca. I saw how he took you for granted, how he never appreciated what he had. You were wasted on him." Rebecca forced herself to maintain eye contact despite her revulsion. "So you decided to murder him?" "I didn't plan for it to happen the way it did," Tom said, his expression becoming distant. "I called him that morning to discuss some irregularities I'd found in his patrol reports. Made up some story about needing to meet privately at my cabin to avoid embarrassing him in front of other rangers. And then, he came willingly, trusting me completely. We talked for a while about the fabricated reports, but then he started asking questions about you, whether I'd been calling you, whether I'd offered to help around the house. He'd noticed things." Tom's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Ethan accused me of having inappropriate feelings for his wife. He said he was going to file a complaint with headquarters, that my behavior was unprofessional. So you killed him." We argued. He got angry, started shouting about how I was supposed to be his friend, his colleague. He turned to leave, said he was going to report everything. I couldn't let that happen." Rebecca felt sick as Tom continued his confession, his voice becoming more animated as he relived the violence. "I picked up a piece of firewood from beside the cabin's fireplace, hit him once in the back of the head. He dropped immediately. And then you buried him in the forest. I drove his body to that remote area 2 days later, took his GPS unit and uniform to make it look like he'd gotten lost during a patrol. I knew all the search protocols. I helped design them. I made sure searchers looked everywhere except where they needed to look. Tom stepped closer, his eyes bright with an intensity that terrified Rebecca. But don't you see? I did it for us, for the life we could have together. Ethan was just an obstacle. There is no us, Tom. There never was. Tom's expression darkened. You're confused right now, angry. But once you understand what I've sacrificed for you, what I've planned for our future, the only thing I understand is that you're a murderer who destroyed my life. Tom's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, and Rebecca caught a glimpse of metal. Around them, she noticed several tourists beginning to back away, sensing the tension. You're coming with me, Rebecca, Tom said quietly. I have a cabin in the mountains where we can talk properly, where I can make you understand. I'm not going anywhere with you. Tom's hand emerged from his pocket holding a small knife. The crowd around them began to scatter as people realized what was happening. Yes, you are, Tom said, his friendly mask finally dropping completely. Because if you don't, I'll start cutting people until you change your mind. Rebecca looked into the eyes of the man who had murdered her husband and realized that Detective Sullivan had been right to worry. Tom Brennan hadn't just planned to meet her, he'd planned to take her. The knife glinted under the market's fluorescent lights, as Tom held it low but visible, his eyes scanning the crowd that was quickly dispersing around them. Rebecca could hear screams in the distance as people realized what was happening, but she forced herself to remain calm, remembering Detective Sullivan's instructions. Tom, you don't want to hurt innocent people, Rebecca said, keeping her voice steady. This is between you and me. You're right, Tom replied, his grip tightening on the knife handle. So let's go somewhere private where we can resolve this properly. Rebecca knew that leaving the market meant certain death. Once Tom got her alone, away from witnesses and police surveillance, she would become another victim of his obsession. She needed to keep him talking, keep him in the open where the police could act. Before we go anywhere, I need to understand something, Rebecca said. The morning you called Ethan, did you already know you were going to kill him? Tom's expression shifted, a mixture of pride and regret crossing his features. I hoped I could reason with him, make him understand that he needed to step aside, so you could be with someone who truly appreciated you. But you brought a weapon to the cabin. I brought tools for cabin maintenance, Tom said defensively. The firewood was just there. I acted in the heat of the moment when Ethan became unreasonable. Rebecca could see movement in her peripheral vision. Plainclothes officers slowly closing in, trying to position themselves for a clear shot without endangering civilians. She needed to keep Tom's attention focused on her. What about after you killed him? She asked. Did you feel any remorse? Tom's eyes took on a distant quality. I felt sad that it had come to that, but I also felt relieved. For the first time in years, there was nothing standing between us. I could finally take care of you the way you deserved. By lying to me for 2 years? By watching me grieve while you pretended to search for him? I was protecting you from the truth until you were ready to hear it, Tom said, his voice taking on an almost paternal tone. Grief is a process, Rebecca. I wanted to give you time to heal before we began our life together. Rebecca felt bile rising in her throat. Tom had orchestrated every aspect of her suffering, manipulating her emotions while positioning himself as her savior. The calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. And the insurance money you wanted me to claim? She pressed. Financial security. For our future? Tom replied matter-of-factly. I researched the most efficient way to access those funds so we could start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere else? Tom's grip on the knife shifted as he gestured vaguely. I've been preparing for this day, Rebecca. I have a place picked out in Montana, completely off the grid. No one will find us there. We can build the life that Ethan's selfishness prevented us from having. Rebecca realized with horror that Tom had planned not just Ethan's murder, but her own kidnapping. In his twisted mind, he had convinced himself that she would eventually come to love him once he removed all other options from her life. Tom, I want you to listen to me very carefully, Rebecca said. I will never love you. I will never forgive you for what you did to Ethan, and I will never go anywhere with you willingly. Tom's face darkened, the last vestiges of his reasonable facade falling away. You don't understand what you're saying. You're traumatized, confused. Once we're away from all these distractions, once you see how well I can take care of you, I understand perfectly, Rebecca interrupted. You're a murderer and a stalker who destroyed my life because you couldn't accept rejection. Tom raised the knife higher, his composure finally cracking. You don't get to reject me, he shouted. Not after everything I've done for you. Not after everything I've sacrificed. People around them screamed and ran as Tom's voice echoed through the market. Rebecca could see the red laser dots of sniper scopes dancing across Tom's chest, but she knew the officers were waiting for a clear shot that wouldn't endanger her. You sacrificed nothing, Rebecca said, her own anger finally overriding her fear. You murdered an innocent man because you couldn't handle the fact that he had something you wanted. You're pathetic. Tom lunged forward with the knife, but Rebecca was ready. She threw herself sideways, crashing into a nearby fish display as the blade sliced through the air where she had been standing. The sound of gunshots erupted through the market, 3 quick pops that echoed off the concrete walls. Tom's body jerked and spun, the knife flying from his hand as he collapsed beside the scattered ice and salmon. Rebecca lay on the wet concrete, covered in melting ice and fish scales, watching as Tom Brennan's eyes slowly lost focus. Blood pooled beneath his head, mixing with the water from the disrupted ice display. Detective Sullivan appeared at her side, kneeling to check if she was injured. Mrs. Crawford, are you hurt? Rebecca shook her head, unable to find words. After 2 years of wondering what had happened to her husband, after days of living in fear of his killer, it was finally over. Tom Brennan would never hurt anyone else, never stalk another woman, never destroy another family with his obsession. Paramedics checked Rebecca for injuries and crime scene technicians began their work. She felt something she hadn't experienced since the morning Ethan left for his final patrol. Peace. The nightmare was over. She could finally begin to heal. The aftermath of the shooting at Pike Place Market felt surreal to Rebecca. As she sat in the back of an ambulance wrapped in a thermal blanket and giving her statement to Seattle police detectives, the normal sounds of the city seemed muffled and distant. The market had been cleared and cordoned off, leaving behind only the evidence of violence and the lingering smell of fish and gunpowder. Detective Sullivan sat beside her in the ambulance, his expression a mixture of relief and professional concern. The recording device captured everything, he told her. Tom's full confession will be crucial evidence for closing Ethan's case officially. Rebecca nodded numbly. After 2 years of questions, the investigation would finally be complete. But the clarity she had expected to feel was absent, replaced, instead, by an overwhelming emptiness. Mrs. Crawford, Detective Sullivan continued gently, I know this is difficult, but we need to discuss what happens next. There will be media attention, probably for several weeks, and there will be legal proceedings to formally close your husband's case. What about Tom's body? Rebecca asked, the question surprising her as it emerged. The medical examiner will conduct an autopsy, then his body will be released to his next of kin. He has a sister in California who's been contacted. Rebecca wondered if Tom's sister knew what kind of man her brother had been, or if she too had been deceived by his carefully maintained facade of normalcy and professionalism. Jenny appeared at the ambulance doors, her face pale with worry. Rebecca? Oh my God, are you okay? I'm fine, Rebecca said, though she wasn't sure if that was true. Physically, she was unharmed. Emotionally, she felt as though she was floating outside her own body, observing events rather than experiencing them. Can I take her home now? Jenny asked Detective Sullivan. The paramedics want to observe her for a while longer just to be safe. But yes, after that she's free to go. As the detective moved away to coordinate with other officers, Jenny climbed into the ambulance and wrapped her arms around Rebecca. I was so scared, Jenny whispered. When I heard the news reports about shots fired at the market. It's over, Rebecca said quietly. Tom's dead. He can't hurt anyone else. But even as she spoke the words, Rebecca realized that Tom's death didn't erase the damage he had done. Ethan was still gone. 2 years of her life had still been consumed by grief and uncertainty. The trust she had once felt in the world had still been shattered. An hour later, Rebecca was cleared by the paramedics and allowed to leave. As Jenny drove them back to her apartment, Rebecca stared out the window at the Seattle streets, watching ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. She envied them their normalcy, their ability to assume that the people they trusted wouldn't betray them in the most fundamental way possible. "Rebecca," Jenny said as they waited at a red light, "I know you probably don't want to think about this right now, but you should probably call Mom and Dad. They're going to see this on the news." Rebecca's parents lived in Arizona and had been supportive throughout the ordeal of Ethan's disappearance, but she dreaded the conversation she would have to have with them. "How do you explain that your husband's trusted colleague had been planning to murder him for years?" Back at Jenny's apartment, Rebecca sat on the couch and called her parents. Her mother answered on the first ring. "Rebecca, honey, we just saw the news. Are you all right?" "I'm okay, Mom, it's over. They caught the man who killed Ethan." "We're flying up tomorrow," her mother said immediately. "You shouldn't be alone right now. Jenny's taking care of me. You don't need to. We're coming." Her father's voice cut in. He had taken the phone from her mother. "This isn't negotiable, sweetheart. You're our daughter and you've been through hell." After ending the call, Rebecca realized she felt grateful for her parents' insistence. For 2 years, she had been trying to handle her grief alone, afraid of being a burden to others. Now she was beginning to understand that healing would require accepting help from people who loved her. Detective Sullivan called that evening with an update. "We've been through Tom's cabin more thoroughly. We found detailed plans for your abduction, including maps of remote properties in Montana where he intended to take you. Mrs. Crawford, if you hadn't agreed to meet him today, he would have found another way to get to you." "You mean he was planning to kidnap me regardless?" "Based, on what we found, yes. The meeting at Pike Place Market was just his preferred method because it seemed less risky to him." Rebecca shuddered, realizing how close she had come to disappearing the same way Ethan had. Tom's obsession had been escalating, and her continued rejection of his advances had pushed him toward increasingly desperate measures. "There's something else," Detective Sullivan said. "We found correspondence indicating that Tom had been researching your daily routines for months. He knew your work schedule, your grocery shopping patterns, even your exercise routes. He was preparing to grab you at a time and place where no one would witness it." The violation felt complete. Tom Brennan hadn't just killed her husband. He had been systematically planning to steal her entire life. Every moment of the past 2 years had been lived under the unknown surveillance of a predator. "Detective," Rebecca said, "will the details about his stalking be made public?" "Only what's necessary for the legal proceedings. We'll try to protect your privacy as much as possible." After ending the call, Rebecca sat in the gathering darkness of Jenny's living room, finally allowing herself to fully process what had happened. Tom Brennan was dead. Ethan's murder was solved. The threat to her safety was eliminated. But the work of rebuilding her life was just beginning. 2 weeks after Tom Brennan's death, Rebecca stood at the edge of Hurricane Ridge wearing Ethan's favorite hiking jacket, the one she had found in their closet still smelling faintly of pine and cedar. The October mountains stretched endlessly before her, their peaks dusted with the season's first snow, looking exactly as they had on the morning her husband left for his final patrol. Detective Sullivan had called the day before to inform her that Ethan's case was officially closed. The medical examiner had confirmed the cause of death. The district attorney had declared Tom Brennan the sole perpetrator, and all evidence had been processed and filed. After 734 days of uncertainty, the investigation was complete. Rebecca's parents had returned to Arizona the previous week, satisfied that she was safe and beginning to heal. Jenny had taken a leave of absence from work to stay with her. But Rebecca had finally felt ready to return to her own house, to begin the process of reclaiming the life that Tom Brennan had stolen from her. The Forest Service had organized a memorial service for Ethan, recognizing his 8 years of dedicated service and acknowledging the circumstances of his death. Rebecca had been asked to speak, to share memories of the man whose love for the wilderness had ultimately led to his murder. Standing now where searchers had found Ethan's abandoned truck, Rebecca pulled out the folded pages of the speech she had written. But instead of reading from her prepared remarks, she found herself speaking directly to the mountains that had been such an important part of her husband's life. Ethan loved this place, she said aloud, her voice carrying across the empty ridge. He used to say that the forest kept its own time, that it had been here long before us and would be here long after we were gone. He found peace in that permanence. A gentle wind stirred the evergreen trees around her, creating the whispering sound that Ethan had always said was the forest's way of sharing its secrets. Rebecca had never understood what he meant until now. "I know Tom tried to make me believe that you died because of me," she continued, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "But I understand now that you died because you were a good man who couldn't ignore wrongdoing, even when it came from someone you trusted." Rebecca reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out Ethan's wedding ring, the one that had been found, with his remains. The medical examiner had returned it to her along with his other personal effects, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to look at it until today. The inscription was still visible despite 2 years buried in the earth. "Forever yours, R.C." She had given him the ring 8 years ago, promising to love him in sickness and health for better or worse. She had kept that promise even after his death, even when she didn't know he was dead. "I'm going to be okay," she whispered to the wind. "It's going to take time, but I'm going to build a life you'd be proud of, a life that honors what you stood for." Rebecca had already begun making plans. She would sell the house where she and Ethan had been so happy, where Tom Brennan had violated her sense of safety. She would move somewhere new, perhaps closer to Jenny in Seattle, and find work that felt meaningful again. The Olympic National Forest would be hiring a new assistant, superintendent to replace Tom Brennan. Rebecca had already spoken with the district supervisor about creating a memorial scholarship in Ethan's name, something that would help young people pursue careers in forest conservation. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ridge, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years. Hope. Not the desperate hope she had clung to while Ethan was missing, but a quiet confidence that her life still held purpose and possibility. She kissed Ethan's wedding ring and then scattered his ashes from the ridge where he had spent so many happy hours protecting the wilderness he loved. The wind caught the ashes and carried them into the forest, returning him to the place where he had found such peace. "Thank you for loving me," Rebecca said as the last of the ashes disappeared into the trees. "Thank you for the 8 years we had. And thank you for leaving me that note, for thinking of me even in your final moments." As darkness settled over the mountains, Rebecca walked back to her car, carrying with her the knowledge that while Tom Brennan had taken Ethan's life, he had not been able to destroy the love they had shared, or the strength that love had given her to survive. 6 months later, Rebecca stood in the doorway of her new apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, watching movers carry the last of her carefully selected possessions up the stairs. She had sold the house where she and Ethan had built their life together, keeping only the items that brought her comfort rather than pain. Photographs from their travels, books they had read together, the cast-iron skillet where he had made pancakes every Sunday morning. The move represented more than a change of address. It was Rebecca's declaration that while Tom Brennan had taken her husband and her sense of safety, he had not taken her ability to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. Jenny appeared at the top of the stairs, carrying a box marked "Kitchen," essentials in Rebecca's careful handwriting. "That's the last one," she announced. "You're officially a Seattle resident again." Rebecca had lived in Seattle before meeting Ethan, working as a social worker helping families navigate crisis situations. The skills she had developed then, listening, supporting people through trauma, helping them find paths forward, had served her well during her own recovery. Now she was returning to that work with a deeper understanding of how quickly life could change, how important it was to help people rebuild after devastating loss. "Coffee?" Jenny asked, already knowing the answer. It had become their ritual over the past months, marking significant moments with quiet conversations over steaming mugs. They sat on Rebecca's new couch, surrounded by unpacked boxes, looking out through large windows at the city skyline. The view was completely different from the mountain vistas Rebecca had grown accustomed to, but she found the urban energy comforting. There was something healing about being surrounded by the busy lives of people who didn't know her story, who saw her simply as a new neighbor rather than the widow of a murdered park ranger. "Any regrets about the move?" Jenny asked. Rebecca considered the question carefully. "No regrets about leaving. Some sadness maybe, but not regrets. That house was part of my life with Ethan, but it was also where Tom Brennan's shadow touched. Everything. I needed somewhere that was just mine." Her phone buzzed with a text from Detective Sullivan, who had become an unexpected source of support during her recovery. Scholarship fund reached $50,000 milestone. Ethan would be proud. Rebecca smiled, showing the message to Jenny. The Ethan Crawford Memorial Scholarship had grown beyond anything Rebecca had imagined, supported by donations from park rangers across the Pacific Northwest, hiking clubs, and environmental organizations. The fund would provide financial assistance to students studying forest conservation, ensuring that Ethan's passion for protecting wilderness would continue through future generations. "Have you decided what you're going to say at the scholarship presentation?" Jenny asked. "I think so." Rebecca had been invited to speak at the Washington State University Forestry graduation ceremony, where the first scholarship recipient would be announced. "I want to talk about how Ethan believed that protecting the forest was really about protecting the future, that the work he did wasn't just about trees and trails, but about preserving something beautiful for people not yet born." Later that evening, after Jenny had gone home and Rebecca was alone in her new space, she unpacked a small wooden box that contained her most precious remaining connections to Ethan. His final note, warning her about Tom Brennan even in his last moments. A photograph of him in his ranger uniform taken during his first year on the job. The compass he had given her on their wedding day, engraved with the words, "You are my true north." Rebecca held the compass in her palm, watching its needle find magnetic north. For 2 years after Ethan's disappearance, she had felt completely lost, spinning without direction. The discovery of his murder and Tom Brennan's obsession had provided answers, but answers alone hadn't restored her sense of direction. Recovery, she had learned, was not about returning to who she had been before. Tragedy struck. It was about integrating the experience of loss into a new understanding of who she could become. The woman she was now, stronger, more aware of both human cruelty and human kindness, was different from the person who had kissed her husband goodbye on that October morning in 2022. As she prepared for bed in her new home, Rebecca felt something she had thought was lost forever. Excitement about the future. Tomorrow she would start her new job at a crisis intervention center, helping other families navigate the kind of devastating uncertainty she had endured. Next month she would speak at the scholarship ceremony, sharing Ethan's legacy with young people who shared his passion for conservation. Tom Brennan had intended to destroy her life, to isolate her from everyone except him. Instead, his actions had revealed the depth of love and support that surrounded her. Family, friends, colleagues, even strangers had reached out to help her through the darkest period of her life. The forest that Ethan had loved so much operated on cycles of death and renewal, destruction and growth. Rebecca was learning to trust that her own life would follow similar patterns. The part of her life that included Tom Brennan's violence was over. The part that honored Ethan's memory while building something new for herself was just beginning. Outside her window, the city of Seattle hummed with the lives of thousands of people, each carrying their own stories of loss and recovery, love and resilience. Rebecca fell asleep to that sound, no longer feeling alone in the world, no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring.